Hello everybody. This video will cover the main arguments for moral error theory that are made in J.L. Mackey's 1977 book, Ethics: Inventing Right and Wrong. So what is moral error theory? Well, the theory is a view in analytic metaethics, which holds that all moral judgments are false. And why is this? Why would this be the case? Well, the error theorist says that moral judgments attempt to refer to objective moral values, but they systemically fail to do this because objective moral values do not exist. Therefore, moral judgments are systemically false. So, moral error theory is kind of a technical expression of what might more commonly be called moral nihilism. I would define moral nihilism as a general view, saying that there are no objective moral truths, that moral judgments have no absolute force, and that there are no categorical or universal moral obligations. Within continental philosophy, there have definitely been many writers that have struggled with moral nihilism. Some of the ones that come to mind are the atheist existentialists like Sartre and Albert Camus. Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, looks at, how do we confront a morally, meaningless or empty universe? Why not commit suicide? Why go on living, and so on. So there's certainly a lot of struggle with moral nihilism within the continental tradition. Within analytic philosophy, the classic expression of moral error theory is in J.L. Mackey's book, Ethics: Inventing Right and Wrong, which he published in 1977. So, the slides here will go over several questions about error theory. Starting at the ground level, what is metaethics in analytic philosophy, and then where does error theory fit into to the taxonomy of metaethics that analytic philosophers work within. Then what are the core arguments that Mackey gives for error theory, and there are two influential ones that I'll talk about: the argument from disagreement and the argument from weirdness. While talking about these arguments, we'll also consider how opponents might respond to the arguments, and then we'll also spend some time looking at, the possible implications of error theory for ethics. The question basically being, if all moral judgments are false, what happens to morality? So, what is metaethics? Well, it's kind of a term used in analytic philosophy for the study of the status of ethics, and specifically, there are two kinds of question that analytic metaethics looks at: a metaphysical question and a semantic question. So let's look first at the metaphysical question. Mackey and others might refer to this as an ontological question, ontology being the study of being. I'm going to call it metaphysical because I think it's a more commonly used term. But the way we could put this question is basically, are there moral facts? And Mackey does put this in terms of, are there objective values in the world? Objectivists say yes, there are moral facts, and they are mind independent. They exist independently of our minds, and these moral facts hold regardless of what we think about morality. Subjectivists, on the other hand, say that there are no mind independent moral facts, and the subjectivists from there can go one of two ways. They can say, yes, there are moral facts, but they're mind-dependent. Moral facts are in some substantive way constituted by our moral thinking. But they could also go the way of the error theorist, and subjectivists could say, nope, there are no moral facts at all. So the second question is the semantic question, and this can be put, basically as, can moral judgments be true or false? Are they the kinds of judgments, the kinds of propositions that are truth-apt, as is said in analytic philosophy sometimes? Cognitivists say, yes, moral judgments have cognitive content. That's why they're called cognitivists. And what that means is basically that they express beliefs that can be true or false. I mean, basically, cognitivists say moral judgments stake a claim about the world, and these judgments, like many others that express beliefs, can indeed be true and can be false. Now, non-cognitivists deny this, and they say that moral judgments don't, strictly speaking, have cognitive content. They cannot be true or false. A frequent move made by non-cognitivists is to say that moral judgments express attitudes. So if I say stealing is wrong, I really mean boo, stealing, or I disapprove of stealing. So where does error theory fit into this taxonomy of metaethics within analytic philosophy? Well, I'm going to go quickly through this just so you can get a feel for where it fits in. If you combine objectivism, the view that there are mind-independent moral facts, with cognitivism, the view that moral judgments can be true or false because they have cognitive content, you wind up typically with forms of moral realism. Moral realism does break down into naturalism and non-naturalism. I won't go into those, but that's the general way it branches out. And if you are a subjectivist and or non-cognitivist, you would frequently consider yourself or be considered a moral anti-realist. So if you combine subjectivism, the denial of mind-independent moral facts, with non-cognitivism, the view that usually that moral judgments are just expressions of attitudes, we get expressivism, which is basically what I talked about before. Stealing is wrong means boo to stealing. When we combine subjectivism and cognitivism, that is, when we deny there are mind-independent moral facts, but at the same time say that moral judgments can be true or false, we get some interesting kind of middle ground theories. Constructivism might be one of those, and constructivism would say there are moral facts, constituted by our moral thinking or our moral activity, and judgments about these facts can be true or false. Relativism can either be of the individualistic or the cultural flavor. And these would say that, moral judgments are true relative to what a particular individual thinks, or morally thinks. Or moral judgments are true relative to the practices, the moral practices of a particular culture. And error theory goes a different way. So error theory says there are no mind-independent moral facts. Moral judgments can be true or false, but and this is kind of the kicker here, all moral judgments are false. I'll say quickly that there are some constructivist theories that probably consider themselves to mark a third way between objectivism and subjectivism, and the issue here is what exactly we're talking about when we talk about mind independence. I mean, really we're talking about, in the case of humans, or more broadly, rational minds. And so, there might be kind of criteria that rationality itself demands, rational minds kind of meet. And that means that, although maybe moral truths are in some way constituted by our minds, they're also not strictly speaking subjective in the classical sense. So we'll put that aside, but I just wanted to flag it. So now we are at what are the arguments for error theory? Well, I would like to start with the semantic question and kind of move through it more quickly before turning to the metaphysical question. Again, the semantic question is, can moral judgments be true or false? And Mackey and error theorists are cognitivists. Mackey says that non-cognitive analyses leave out the apparent authority of ethics. What he's getting at here is that moral judgments do seem to express beliefs and to make or issue or point toward authoritative demands, either that one is, saying, imposing on oneself maybe, or, trying to impose upon others. And it doesn't really seem in our moral experience that moral judgments do nothing but merely express attitudes. I mean, when I say, you shouldn't torture babies for fun, I don't really tend to think that all I'm doing is saying, hey, I disapprove of torturing babies. Rather, I seem to be staking some kind of substantive claim with cognitive content about what's right or wrong, and I tend to think that it can be true or false. So, all this goes to say that non-cognitivist semantics has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of heavy lifting involved there, because you have to account for why the surface experience, the surface kind of semantics, is actually wrong. And so what this means is that non-cognitivist semantics quickly gets very complicated and also faces some problems. The Frege-Geach problem is not something I'll go into, but it's kind of one of the most prominent problems faced by non-cognitivist semantics. Basically has to do with the meaning of moral judgments when they're embedded in certain propositions, like conditional propositions, versus like when they stand alone. But basically, suffice it to say, there's a lot of technical issues here, and that means that error theory has a certain strength that is derived from its cognitivism, which is that it just has a much more common sense semantics. So let's move on now to the metaphysical question, which again is one that Mackey might call an ontological question about being. But the metaphysical question is basically, are there moral facts in the world? And Mackey offers two arguments. The first is the argument from disagreement. He calls this the argument from relativity. It's really much more of an argument from disagreement to relativity. So in some ways, his name is kind of a question-begging misnomer. So I'm going to follow some other philosophers like Michael Huemer, and just call this the argument from disagreement. The second is the argument from weirdness. Mackey calls this the argument from queerness, and that's just dated terminology, so I'm going to call it the argument from weirdness. So let's start with the argument from disagreement. Well, this argument starts from the kind of basic observation, which maybe not many of us would really dispute, kind of on its face, that there is widespread and intractable moral disagreement both within cultures and across cultures. So, for example, in American culture, there is widespread disagreement, and people are really dug in on the issue of whether or not abortion is morally permissible. And then across cultures, maybe an example would be disagreement about the moral permissibility of monogamy or polygamy. Kind of as marriage institutions. So there's a lot of disagreement, and it tends to seem kind of irresolvable when people dig in. And then we can add on to this the intuition that all this disagreement, is very different from disagreement in the sciences. Disagreement in the sciences seems to be in principle resolvable. And whenever there is disagreement among scientists, we tend to think, and historically it seems to have been the case, that this is just due to there being insufficient evidence. Once the right evidence is kind of finally acquired, there's a convergence of scientific opinion. But this doesn't really seem to be the case for morality. I mean, what would the evidence even be? And even so, morality doesn't seem in general to be converging to quite the same degree as scientific thought is. I think it's worth saying that moral realists probably would want to argue this point, or could argue this point, and say, hey, actually, there's been a lot of convergence of moral thought. For example, we now have converged upon the belief that slavery is morally impermissible. That was not always taken for granted, surely. I mean, it was a widespread practice, right? So this is a debatable point, but I think there's a lot of intuitive force here, so I'm going to set kind of that aside and carry on. So Mackey says that disagreement about moral codes seems to reflect adherence to and participation in different ways of life. And the example he uses is the one I used above, monogamy versus polygamy. So, it doesn't seem that people wind up morally supporting monogamy versus polygamy because they sit back, think about the general abstract moral arguments, decide which one they think is correct, and then from there, move toward supporting that institution. And cultures don't really seem to do this at an aggregate kind of level. Rather, instead, it seems like people live in either monogamous or polygamous cultures, and kind of from there wind up believing that monogamy or polygamy is morally permissible. So the kind of implication of this account is that ways of life shape our moral judgments rather than moral judgments shaping our ways of life. And given this interpretation of moral disagreement, or this account of it, Mackey basically wants to say that the cleanest explanation for what's going on here is that there are no objective moral facts. If there were objective moral values, if there were moral facts out in the world, we would be kind of, accessing these, tracking them, and we would be, doing these moral judgments, and then they would be shaping our ways of life rather than the other way around. So there is kind of a response that can be made to this, and here I'm going to outline in very general terms an argument made by David O. Brink a couple years after Mackey's book came out. So we can start with this argument by, and I'll dig into it more in the following slides, by distinguishing between genuine moral disagreement and merely apparent moral disagreement, and then distinguishing between what is actually moral disagreement versus what seems to be moral disagreement but is actually non-moral disagreement. And then from there we can say, once we've isolated and kind of narrowed down the disagreements to genuine moral disagreements, well, a lot of those, many of them, are going to wind up being resolvable. And we don't have to say they all are resolvable, but we can say that many of them are. So let's start with the first distinction, genuine versus apparent moral disagreement. I mean, the argument here is that people share general moral principles and only wind up seeming to disagree morally because these principles are applied to radically different circumstances. And Mackey does consider this. But basically the example here is, say the general moral principle that we all actually kind of might adhere to, stealing is wrong. I mean, if you apply this principle to the circumstance in which, say, a criminal syndicate is shaking down an elderly couple, you kind of get one result. But if you apply this principle to the situation in which impoverished parents are shoplifting food for their children to feed their family, you get a different result. And so we might wind up seeming like we're disagreeing about whether or not stealing is wrong holds as a moral principle, but it's actually just because we're looking at these different situations. And so once we kind of separate out genuine versus apparent moral disagreement, it might, after we've kind of reached a balance between these, we've specified our general moral principles more to reflect our intuitions about particular circumstances, it might seem that genuine moral disagreement is not quite so widespread and intractable. It's actually circumstances that are causing apparent moral disagreement. And so, Mackie does anticipate this distinction and says that his argument from disagreement can only partly be countered with this line of argument. What he says is that the distinction forces the objectivist to say that it's only the general moral principles that are being used here that actually have objective validity, and not our specific moral judgments about situations. Instead, the situational judgments have objective validity, or could be true, but only derivatively or contingently. That is, they're only true or valid because of the general moral principles that are kind of at hand. So there's a question here about to what degree derivative validity or contingent validity actually might kind of threaten moral realism. I'm going to set that aside, but that is how Mackie kind of responds to this genuine versus apparent moral disagreement distinction. Let's look at the second distinction I talked about a few slides ago, which is that between moral and non-moral disagreement. I mean, the argument here is that people can disagree morally only because they disagree on the relevant non-moral facts. So let's take two examples. I mean, people used to think that non-human animals were automata, or however you say this. Basically, they were systems of sensory inputs and behavioral outputs without any mental life, and so didn't, strictly speaking, suffer, and so like vivisection and all this stuff was totally fine. Similarly, people used to argue that the freedom of non-white men could be justly restricted because white men were inherently biologically superior. I mean, these are both facts. The basis of these moral views or these factual claims are just wrong. And once we've kind of reached consensus that they're wrong, discovered that they're wrong, convinced the appropriate people that they are indeed wrong, the moral disagreement kind of falls away. So moral disagreement that is based on non-moral disagreement is resolvable much the way that scientific disagreement is resolvable. Okay, so now that we have this kind of idea of a genuine moral disagreement, the moral realist might say, actually, a lot of these are resolvable. And I think an important point here is that we don't have to say all of them are resolvable. There could be moral ties where things kind of come out even and it's hard to know which way to go. There could be things called, incommensurable values. These are values that don't share a common measure and so can't really be pitted against each other in a rational way. Like take liberty and security as an example. Maybe like trade-offs between liberty and security actually don't have kind of this like resolvable, we can't really resolve debates about these trade-offs because there's not really a common measure between liberty and security. And so in this case, in those kinds of cases, we might just say that, hey, those are genuine moral disagreements there about liberty versus security, but at the end of the day, they're not resolvable. But what we can say, maybe, or according to to Brink's argument for realism, is that a lot of genuine moral disagreements really can be resolved and have been resolved historically by just comparing the general principles we accept to intuitions about particular cases and kind of refining each in turn. So that is the argument from disagreement. Let's look now at the argument from weirdness. So there are two parts to this argument: the core metaphysical part and the kind of the kind of epistemological part that follows. The metaphysical part is basically put by Mackie like this. He says that if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. And I think it's pretty easy to see what he's getting at here. I mean, what exactly is a moral value, and how does it fit into our normal scientific, perhaps naturalistic understanding of the world? I mean, we can't point out moral values like we can other parts of the world. It's not like I'm going to be in a room and be like, hey, here's a chair, or there's a table, and over there in the corner you might see a moral value. Over there is courage or something, right? That's not how it works. And so, as Mackie says, moral values don't seem to be part of the fabric of the world. I think the use of fabric is kind of instructive. I mean, it's not like a piece of furniture, right? This seems very weird relative to those everyday objects. And there's a second part to this, which is that given this metaphysical weirdness, Mackey says that correspondingly, if we were aware of objective values, it would have to be by some special faculty of moral perception or intuition, which would be utterly different from our ways of knowing anything else. So, we can perceive the chair in the corner. We can investigate it with scientific methods, but we can't perceive moral values like that or investigate moral values like that. So plenty of philosophers, maybe with a slightly rationalistic bent, have kind of evoked a faculty of moral intuition or perception, and Mackey says, hey, this is just a super weird faculty, a super weird ability that actually seems kind of occult. It doesn't really belong in a scientific and naturalistic picture of the world. It doesn't fit in with the rest of that picture of the world. So the response to the argument from weirdness basically points out that there are a bunch of other really kind of weird entities that we also might think exist. So let's think about a few. Numbers and sets. Plenty of philosophers and perhaps mathematicians are certainly realists about numbers. Mathematics is absolutely essential for science, for our scientific accounts and of the world and our theories about the world. And so it certainly seems that numbers in some sense are real. Set theory, which plays into our account of what's going on in mathematics. Many people like Quine, for example, think that sets are real. They're Platonists about sets. But these things certainly aren't like the furniture in the corner. Numbers seem weird. Okay, if they're real, in what sense are they real? Let's think about a few others. Modals, having to do with counterfactuals. Think about possible objects. The pie that I could bake right now. Possible persons. Future generations. Our obligations to future generations are frequently evoked in moral discussion. That's weird. What is a possible person? Analytic philosophers frequently speak about possible worlds. Some are more realists about that than others, but it's certainly something that we can talk about, it seems, coherently, and if it's, kind of like fits into our account of what's going on with possibility, what kind of a thing is a possible world. Causal relationships are very strange. If you read any Hume, Hume says that all we see is constant conjunction, basically correlation. We never observe one thing causing another. We never directly observe cause and effect. So that seems fundamentally kind of strange. And here are a few others. The past, the future. We talk about history, but the past certainly doesn't seem, on its face, to be real in the same way as the present. One doesn't necessarily have to be a presentist to share that intuition. It could be a four-dimensionalist and still say the past seems like kind of strange relative to the present. Mental states, consciousness. These seem unlike physical objects in very substantial ways. They're even theories of consciousness now, philosophies of mind, that think that consciousness is fundamentally mysterious, and so in that sense kind of fundamentally weird. That's the new Mysterians. So we don't really know what's going on with consciousness. It seems kind of weird. So what about that, right? And of course there are other kind of like things used by analytic philosophers like propositions, properties. All these things are arguably as weird as objective moral values. So what does Mackey have to say to this kind of argument? Well, he does directly address it, and he calls it the companions in guilt counter-argument, which I think is a good name. What Mackey says is that the only adequate reply to this counter would be to show how on empiricist foundations we can construct an account of the ideas and beliefs and knowledge that we have of all of these matters. So of all of the things on the previous slide, Mackey says we're going to need an empiricist account of all of those objects. And he says that if those entities resist empiricist treatment, then they should also be targets of the argument from weirdness, along with objective values. And so this kind of shows the degree to which Mackey's kind of committed to a full-fledged empiricism. And kind of, that's a big burden for the argument from weirdness to carry. There's plenty of debate in fields of philosophy that consider each one of the objects on the previous slide about whether or not you can account for it in purely empiricist terms, nominalist terms, or whether or not you need to go another way. But to say across the board for every single one of them, either we account for them in empiricist terms or they got to go. Well, that's just kind of a strong claim, and the stronger the claim, the bigger the burden of proof, and so the argument from weirdness kind of has a lot of baggage that it carries along with it. So now I'd like to turn to think about what the implications are of accepting error theory. If all moral judgments are false, what does that mean for moral practice? So, you know, there are basically two approaches that error theorists can take to moral practice. The first is eliminativism, and this holds that because all moral judgments are false, we should just go ahead and stop making moral judgments. I mean, this seems to be the kind of intuitive implication of moral nihilism. If what we're doing is just, misguided and fundamentally kind of incorrect, then it kind of seems like, well, why don't we put an end to it? But error theorists do say that they are not logically forced into this position. That's for a number of reasons, including some things we'll think about on the following slides. One possible issue I want to highlight is whether eliminativism assumes an epistemic norm, which error theory actually can't support. I mean, eliminativism, in its kind of most plausible form, or maybe strongest form, says, we really should stop making moral judgments because we should not be saying false things. But that is, a normative claim that certainly can't be backed up by any objective moral values per error theory. So you kind of wonder where the normative force of this claim that we should stop engaging in moral judgment kind of comes from. And this does point to a much more general question, which is what happens to epistemic norms under error theory. We do think in general we should only believe things with adequate evidence, say for example, or we shouldn't believe things that are false. These are normative claims in epistemology, and what happens to them if we say all normative claims are false? Well, it's kind of a good question to think about. There is a second way that error theorists can go besides eliminativism, and that is fictionalism. This view says that we can, and keeping in mind the problems I just raised, possibly should, carry on making moral judgments without believing in their truth. So we do consistently do this in other areas. It's a weird idea, right? We do consistently do this. Let's take, for example, judgments about characters in books. I can say Harry Potter is a wizard and, engage in that, fictionalistic discourse without, thinking that strictly speaking it's true. And perhaps more relevantly, I can say Voldemort is evil, and consider that kind of a fictionalistic judgment, without strictly speaking thinking that it's true. But there is, I think, probably a more pressing question with fictionalism, which we won't go into. But basically, is it psychologically possible to be fictionalists specifically about morality? I mean, unlike judgments about characters in books, unlike judgments about Harry Potter, I mean, moral judgments are, basically central to our lives. They're incredibly important. And can we really go on, making various normative claims, various moral judgments, while thinking that they actually are false? So that's an interesting question worth thinking about. Mackey is a fictionalist. He is not an eliminativist. And that's why the subtitle of his Ethics, the book that puts forward the kind of classical expression of error theory, is Inventing Right and Wrong. So here are a few quotes from Mackey to kind of give the flavor of his fictionalism. So Mackey says that morality is not to be discovered, but to be made. We have to decide what moral views to adopt and what moral stands to take. Later in the book, he goes on further, saying, there's no merit in pretending our choices are rationally constrained in ways they're not. We are free to mold or remold our moral system so as to better promote whatever it is that we do value. But there's an important caveat here. He says it doesn't follow that an individual is free to invent whatever moral system they want. Rather, morality performs a certain sort of social function, and for it to do so, it has to be adopted socially by a group of people in their dealings with one another. And so that kind of puts constraints on the possible content of morality. And so the question here is kind of what social function is Mackey talking about? Well, he says the function of morality is primarily to counteract the limitation of men's sympathies. So basically the idea here is that humans are fundamentally self-interested, perhaps psychologically egoistic, and that this creates all sorts of problems when we try and cooperate or coordinate, what are frequently called collective action problems, and that we can, through morality, overcome some of these collective action problems. And by overcoming these problems, basically we increase our survivability, but more generally, morality, moral sentiments enable social groups in which they take root to flourish. And so this is in many ways, well, maybe, very directly an evolutionary account of kind of what's going on in moral discourse and what's going on with moral sentiments. I mean, Mackey says that the ordinary evolutionary pressures natural selection accounts for the spread of morality. I'm not going to go much deeper into the kind of evolutionary side of this, but I do want to point out that this is a falsifiable empirical claim about what's going on, with morality, what kind of consequences it has, what kind of relationship it has to evolutionary theory. And under error theory, this whole kind of thing about there being an evolutionary advantage to morality or morality contributing to flourishing does not provide an objective normative reason to engage with morality. This isn't like a tactic that I think the error theorists can use against the amoralist, as Bernard Williams might say, to get them to opt into morality. This is a much more descriptive kind of claim, and one that probably could be subject to kind of any number of criticisms by, for example, evolutionary biologists. So, kind of taking all that in stride, Mackey builds on this and devotes the second half of his book to defending a first-order moral theory that is broadly rights-based instead of utilitarian. So, there's kind of this question here, like he's just rejected all moral facts. How is this consistent with his error theory? Well, Mackey and other error theorists say that metaethical theories don't have necessary implications for ethical theories. So, as kind of a reminder from the preface and first chapter of his book, a first-order moral view is like a particular moral judgment, like stealing is wrong. And a second-order moral view is a metaethical theory about what's going on in, say, moral judgment. So what he's saying here is that first-order, in this first quote here, that first-order moral views and second-order metaethical views are not only distinct from each other, but completely independent. And he says further that first-order moral judgments are not necessarily affected by the truth or falsity of a second-order metaethical view. So I would call this an independence thesis about what's going on in first-order moral judgments and second-order metaethical views, and it's worth considering. I would say there's a kind of a disadvantage and an advantage for error theory to kind of pushing this independence thesis, and I'll talk more about them in the following slides and kind of flush out a bit. But the disadvantage kind of at first seems to be that we would think that higher order theories like metaethics or metaethical views about what's going on objectively with moral values, tell us something at least about what's acceptable in lower order theories. So metaphysics tells us to some degree what's kind of acceptable in our theories about the physical world. Metaethics tells us to some degree, about what's acceptable in our ethical theories. But the independence thesis particularly rejects this for moral thought. So I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, because you would tend to think that second-order views would impact first-order views, not only in ethics, but across the board. The advantage here, though, is that the independence thesis protects error theory from specifically moral arguments against moral nihilism, such as Morean arguments, which I'll talk more about in a slide or two. But basically, nihilism seems to have this radical moral implications, and so if we think that that's morally unacceptable to just brush all of brush all these moral judgments aside as false, we might launch a moral argument against moral nihilism. But Mackey says, hold on, they're totally independent. Nihilism doesn't have any implications for what we do in first order morality. So let's start with kind of the first of the two things I just mentioned. Do higher order theories, like metaethical theories, constrain lower order theories? For example, what we're doing in moral judgment? Well, it does seem counterintuitive to say that moral nihilism specifically has no impact at all on moral practice, right? I mean, this was what was struggled with by the atheist existentialists that I mentioned on the first slide. Camus has this whole epic thing about rolling the rock up the hill like Sisyphus, having it roll back down and, carrying on in the face of the absurd. And that seems to me to really actually face what's kind of going on with moral meaninglessness. I mean, that radically undermines our sense of who we are, what we do, what things are worth. And it's kind of weird to just say that moral nihilism has no impact at all on our moral views about ourselves and the world. And Mackey does seem to recognize this, and here's the quote. He says, it's quite true that it's logically possible that this subjective concern, the activity of valuing or thinking of things as wrong, should go on just the same whether there are objective values or not. But it doesn't follow, Mackey says, and it's not true that there is no difference between these two worlds. There he's talking about a world with objective moral values and a world without objective moral values. He says in one of those worlds, there's something that backs up and validates some of this subjective concern, some of the valuing. which people have and do about things. And then the other one, there's nothing to back it up. So this, I think, recognizes some of what the atheist existentialists are all about, but it kind of seems to grind against the independence thesis a little bit. And there's another more technical point here where Mackie kind of tends to vacillate. I mean, he likes to talk about this one example from Henry Sidgwick, which was, he was a prominent utilitarian, British utilitarian, who wrote probably the most exhaustive and exhausting book there is defending utilitarian theory, called The Methods of Ethics. It kind of follows every single conceivable twist and turn, along the line of utilitarian argument, discusses every objection, perhaps ad nauseum, that might be lodged against utilitarianism. And Mackie talks about this thing that Sidgwick points out. Sidgwick says, like, hey, we have the egoist that says, all I'm going to do is pursue my own happiness. Well, if we were to convince the egoist that happiness, maybe on their own view, is an objective good, is objectively good, well, then they could no longer be an egoist, because if it's objectively good, happiness, then it can't be, appropriate to consider that their happiness is more important than others. The fact that the happiness that the egoist is pursuing is their own doesn't matter. It's objectively good for everybody to be happy, regardless of who they are. So Mackie takes from this quote here. He says that, if ethics is built on the concept of objective goodness, then egoism as a first-order moral system, or method of ethics, as Sidgwick says, can be refuted. Whereas if it's assumed that goodness is only subjective or like a rational thing to pursue, then it cannot. So this seems to directly say that if at a meta-ethical level we think goodness is objective, well then first-order egoism can be ruled out. Okay, so that's not consistent with the independence thesis. I mean, Mackie goes further, though, whenever he incorporates his own arguments as undermining certain first-order moral arguments, specifically this thing that Sidgwick talks about. I mean, Mackie says this argument above, here in the first quote, is not blatantly fallacious, which is, quite the compliment, but that it's not cogent within the context of his book, because the key assumption that something or other is intrinsically desirable or objectively good has been undermined by the rejection of all objective values in Chapter 1. So here he's saying that the rejection of objective values does have first-order implications. In fact, it rules out this argument that Sidgwick tries to make in first-order ethics against first-order egoism. So basically this is all to say that Mackie says two things that are totally in tension. He says that first and second-order views are independent of one another, that his error theory doesn't affect ethics. But he also says that first-order views can rule out that second-order views can rule out certain first-order views, or that second-order views can impact first-order debates. So this is an unresolved tension in Mackie's ethics. And this raises kind of a further problem. Okay, so if we kind of follow the second of Mackie's two kind of contradictory ways of thinking about this, and we reject the independence thesis, and we say that second-order views, like error theory, can actually constrain what's acceptable in first-order views, like, for example, what was going on in the debate with the egoist, well, then why can't first-order views also constrain what's acceptable in second-order views? That is, why can't our moral judgments have an impact on moral nihilism? You might say that this seems to get things exactly backwards, but some accounts of theory choice, or how we go about choosing which theories of the world we're going to accept or reject, within the tradition of virtue epistemology and analytic philosophy, suggests that first-order normative judgments regarding certain epistemic virtues, such as like simplicity and elegance, in fact actually do constrain second-order views in science and other areas. I mean, we in general think that it's appropriate to accept the simplest and most elegant of the available theories, but these are kind of normative notions in themselves. And so it does seem that first-order moral judgments about whether or not something is simple or elegant actually does have implications that are much broader than just kind of in first-order discourse. So this is to say that it's not patently absurd that first-order moral views could actually constrain our second-order meta-ethical views. And this is exactly what's kind of done in so-called Morean arguments against moral nihilism. I mean, these suggest that we can reject the second-order view of error theory on account of our first-order moral judgments. And the form of this argument is the same as G.E. Moore's famous "here is a hand" argument against global skepticism that rules out all knowledge whatsoever about the external world. Very quickly, G.E. Moore's "here is a hand" argument basically kind of inverts the classic argument for skepticism. the classic argument for skepticism says, if it's possible if it could be the case that a certain skeptical possibility obtains, then I don't know anything for sure about the external world. So, for example, if it's possible I'm in the Matrix, I don't know that the everyday objects around me actually are there and that they're real. So, for example, if I could possibly be in the Matrix, I don't know that these things here are actually my hands, right? Because I'm actually in like the pod or whatever, and this is just a program. So G.E. Moore's argument flips this on its head. G.E. Moore's argument accepts that, if it's possible that I'm in the Matrix, then I don't know that these are my hands. But then he says, actually, I'm looking at my hands right here. Here it is, right? Here's one right here on the right. Here's one right here on the left. Therefore, I know there are two objects in the external world. Therefore, I know that the skeptical possibility doesn't obtain. I know that I'm not in the Matrix. This might seem like some sleight of hand to anyone who's hearing about this argument for the first time, but it basically just, again, inverts the form of the argument from, say, like modus ponens to modus tollens. I encourage you to kind of look into it a bit more, because it's hard to know how to attack after kind of just seeing how it flips the kind of burden proof. But basically the issue is that if we have much higher confidence in the fact that these are two hands right here than in the fact that I might be in the Matrix, then we can go ahead and rule out skepticism. So what Morean, in the context of error theory and moral nihilism, what Morean arguments do is they pick out first-order moral propositions in which we have high confidence, and it kind of runs with kind of a similar line. So let's take, for example, the moral judgment that it's true that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong. So we kind of have two, this is inconsistent with error theory, right, which says that this judgment is false. So we kind of have a question here, like, do we have higher confidence in our judgment that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong? Or do we have higher confidence in our judgment that all these abstract arguments about objective values and disagreement and weirdness are 100% correct? Well, it seems like in practice, it actually is the case that we have much higher confidence in the judgment that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong. I mean, we don't even really care about these arguments for error theory, these metaphysical arguments outside of the philosophy classroom in general, while we absolutely seem committed to these maybe uncontroversial or, seriously held first-order moral judgments. So to the degree that thinking that these judgments are true is inconsistent with moral nihilism, and we have a higher confidence in them than any arguments put forward by the error theorist, then we can go ahead and reject moral nihilism for what seems to be moral reasons. And I just want to wrap up by kind of like thinking about how Mackie might respond to this. I think that Mackie's fictionalism has one advantage over eliminativism, which is the other way, right, for error theorists to go. And that's that eliminativism particularly seems to be subject to these Morean, these moral arguments against error theory. I mean, that's because eliminativism says that we have to actually stop making all these high confidence moral judgments that we have. We need to stop saying that torturing babies for fun is wrong and that we know that that is true. But under Mackie's fictionalism and fictionalism more generally, don't forget that we actually can carry on with moral discourse and we can carry on making moral judgments. We just have to kind of know in the background that strictly speaking, they're all false. So what that means is that we could kind of hold on to some of these high confidence judgments. For example, that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong. But what we couldn't hold on to is the judgment that it is true that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong. So there's a question here as to what degree fictionalism is subject to these moral arguments against error theory, and it also just kind of again points to the broader questions of if we're going to accept the arguments for error theory and say that all moral judgments are false, can we really carry on with morality as normal and just kind of regard it as a useful fiction? So that's all I have on error theory. It's certainly an interesting theory. It raises a lot of questions, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.